Hey everybody, CVH here, and today we got a pretty substantial amount of card changes announced for Elder Scrolls Legends that are going to be implemented today after the patch that's happening right now is done updating. And as I like to do on this channel, I'm going to do a video going over what the changes are and giving my opinions on them in case you haven't heard the news, in case you get your news from this channel, or just like hearing my opinions. I'll be discussing what's changed. Some cards have been buffed, some cards have been nerfed, and then giving my opinions on the pros, the cons, and even some speculation on where the meta and popular decks currently might move moving forward along with these changes. So if you'd like to follow along and read all the patch notes, or just to see them really quickly, I'll be leaving the link to this very article I'm looking at in the description down below, so you go ahead and click that if you want. But as you can see, the first card change is already right on the screen. No point in trying to beat around the bush any longer. Let's get right into some card changes with Solitaire, which is now moving up to a 3 Magicka card. Obviously one of the most powerful, if not the most powerful, I think, shouts in the game. Probably still the most powerful shout in the game at 3 Magicka. This is obviously their, I think, based on the rest of the card changes, I don't want to spoil too much, but it looks like their single attempt at really making Scout a bit worse, because Ram Scout has been such an oppressive almost deck in the later stages of the game. Solitaire definitely gives the deck a crazy amount of utility, as I've mentioned before. Moving up to 3 cost, however, I actually expected something a bit more severe for this card. Now, don't get me wrong, I really enjoy what this card brings to the table, but I was thinking maybe a Magicka cost increase wouldn't matter too much because, well, Ram Scout's the deck in the game that can get to the highest total max Magicka of any deck in the game, and when you're playing Solitaire late in the game to reuse unique legendaries or charge creatures or guard creatures, it's very rare that the Magicka really matters that much. Unlike a couple other cards we'll be mentioning in today's video, the Solitaire is used in such a slow deck that often when you play these later turns, you're floating Magicka pretty regularly, and it doesn't really matter whether it costs 2 or 3. Now, this does make the card a bit worse when you're trying to stabilize against an aggro deck, and you're using it primarily to reuse your guards, and you really have to stay Magicka efficient if you miss a turn and you don't get to play your guard because Solitaire costs a little bit more. That could cause you to lose against aggro, so I like it in that respect, but in the late game, this card is still pretty much just as powerful as ever in my opinion. The next change is what I think many of my viewers and many players in general have been looking for a good 6 to 8 months maybe, and that is Supreme Atromancer moving to a 10 Magicka creature. I didn't think it was going to happen, but, you know, if they're nerfing Scout a little bit, it makes sense that they would nerf maybe one of the best cards against Scout as well, just in case that doesn't get too oppressive. But Supreme Atromancer, like it says here, it offers so much late game power that it can push out other slow decks. These two cards, along with Solitaire, I mean, contributed to a metagame that felt very hostile to slower midrange and control decks. So they're hoping metagame diversity should improve. Now, Atromancer is actually, I think, maybe seen a little bit less play recently. What this might do is make the mid-range decks that typically played, I'm talking about Sorcerer, Assassin, and Mage, look towards other mid to late game finishers. For example, the last video I published with mid-range Sorcerer, as you would notice, it played 3 copies of Bone Colossus, but no Atromancer. Now that wasn't a premonition of this nerf or anything. Bone Colossus is just really good, so perhaps mid-range Sorcerer might not want to play that 10 cost. I'm not exactly sure how many of these decks would still want to play Atromancer at a 10 cost. It's obviously still very powerful if you're getting those Nord Firebrand synergies along with the Merrick Battle Mage deck. You probably still want to play it. Maybe mid-range Sorcerer does look more to cards like Bone Colossus. Maybe mid-range Mage looks more to cards like Golden Saint. I don't really know what mid-range Assassin does. It sort of relies pretty heavily on Atromancer and Tazcad, and you can only play one Tazcad, so that's very interesting to see. I guess it's a nerf that many people would think has been a long time coming, but personally, I never found the card too oppressive. I think it countered Scout in a very unique way, and personally, just based on these two nerfs, I think the Atromancer bumping up to 10 does more to help Scout than the Solitaire nerf does to hinder Scout, so I'm not exactly sure if we're going to see a decrease in power level of Scout. Not to spoil too much, but none of the other card changes really negatively affect Scout. So, let's move on to the next one. Shieldbreaker to a 3 cost. Now, I think I mentioned Shieldbreaker in my underrated cards video for Heroes of Skyrim. Shieldbreaker really surprised everyone, I think, in how good it really was in aggro decks. Now, I'm pretty surprised to see this on the list here. Besides it being really powerful, I've never really considered it being a problematic card, honestly. And the nerf to 3 Magicka, I think, is pretty severe for this card. It looks, you know, on the surface you could say, well, Solitaire moved to 3 Magicka, why is that not a big deal, but why is this one a big deal? And the answer is really in the type of deck that plays Shieldbreaker versus the type of deck that plays Solitaire. Shieldbreaker, you're playing an aggro red deck, So people who are tired of losing to aggressive red decks probably won't be too sad about this nerf. But in those red decks, or those primarily aggressive decks, it's much more important to not miss any sort of drop. You can't miss your turn 2, you can't miss your turn 3, and Shieldbreaker fits into those turns very efficiently at 2 Magicka. At 3 Magicka, it could push out your creature play alongside of it a little bit more than I think these decks want. Now, I'm not saying this nerf would kill those decks at all. There are definitely ample ways to bypass guards, which is the primary use of Shieldbreaker. At 3, it just seems a little bit more inefficient, and maybe these decks turn back to cards like Earthbone Spinner, which might cost a little bit more, but they guarantee that you get the bypassing of the guard as well as the body on board at the same time. Now, perhaps I'm wrong, perhaps Shieldbreaker still sees a substantial amount of play, but it's kind of interesting they'd nerf these aggressive decks in this way. I thought Shieldbreaker seemed particularly fine for me. Maybe they could reduce the buff somewhat, but the nerf to 3 Magicka, we'll see how playable this card is, and as with all of these card changes, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments down below. Next card change targets token decks. I'm sure if you've seen the last Between the Lanes meta snapshot we just published less than 48 hours ago, you'll notice that 2 token decks made it to our tier 1, and Imprison is a staple in them. Imprison just probably the most efficient removal card in the game. It's just a matter of having a board state that works well with the Imprison, and all of the token mage decks, token crusader, token monk, token spellsword, all of those decks, namely the mage and the crusader, are very, very well equipped to dominate the board early to a point where this 1-cost Imprison can act like piercing javelin more often than not. And of course it does have the versatility of shackling a creature like the unupgraded Detain in a pinch. But at 1 cost, Imprison was proving too efficient a removal spell, removal action. In heavy willpower decks, Imprison will still feel very powerful when you play it with 4 creatures out. Obviously, they have to be willpower creatures, but the risks attached to it are a little larger at 2 cost, and that's definitely true. I don't think this kills token decks, but again, it is worth noting that they are, again, targeting decks that have been traditionally pretty favored against Ram Scouts. That's a pretty interesting line to take. I'm sure people have thought token decks were a bit pushed right now, and this is a pretty elegant way to nerf the decks, in my opinion, because if you nerf any other card in the token decks, literally any of the other cards, really, that could also have sort of byproducts of nerfing other decks in the metagame. Imprison's the only card in them that's really only seen in token decks. So I kind of like the choice of nerfing Imprison here. I'm interested to see how token decks perform with Imprison at 2. I don't think it comes out of the deck by any means, but it'll be interesting to see if they adapt with additional removal at all. The next nerf is Thief of Dreams, which is simply moving from a 5/5 to a 4/4. So I guess the Thief of Dreams nerf alongside the Supreme Atromancer nerf, most notably, is probably Bethesda's attempt at saying, hey, we get it, intelligence is a bit too strong, you guys are tired of seeing it in so many decks, so we'll nerf some cards that have been pretty, not necessarily staple, but definitely serve very important roles in these intelligence decks, like Atromancer as a finisher, and Thief of Dreams is basically the only really good blue 5-drop outside of Iron, which is not even really just intelligence. But Thief of Dreams losing 2 stat points total. This is a pretty serious nerf. I'm actually surprised it's this harsh, given how Thief of Dreams isn't really seen in all intelligence decks in the first place. It's one of the better 5-drops, sure, but I think maybe a nerf to 5/4 would have sufficed here. At 4/4, this card is not only a lot worse at trading, but it is also pushing a lot less damage, so those mid-range decks will be even less inclined to use it. I was personally always excited to play a 5-cost 5/5, answered Thornhist Mage perfectly, and now it just doesn't do that at all. And to say nothing of the fact that it now dies to Lightning Bolt. I don't really need to tell you guys the big difference between having 4 health and 5 health in this game. Besides just dying to that many more things trading into it, it also gets hit by Lightning Bolt, which is one of the most ubiquitous cards in blue decks in the game. So yeah, Thief of Dreams, seeing this nerf, I think it'll probably significantly impact its play, but as always, I'd love to hear your thoughts as well. And now the fun part, we get to talk about some card buffs, cards that are actually being made stronger. And today, they've buffed 3 cards in basically the same exact way. Brynjolf, Cliffside Lookout, and Young Dragonborn, as you can see in front of you, are all just gaining 1 point of health. All 3 of these cards are pretty intriguing, and just haven't found a spot in any deck, basically, I've seen from Heroes of Skyrim, simply because the bodies aren't worth the effect. Their effects can be cool, and in some cases extremely powerful, but the fact that they start with so low stats makes them a serious liability to include against decks that are really focused on playing good creatures on every turn, or powerful removal that can answer them easily. Brynjolf, again, suffered from that 4 health that we just talked about, Thief of Dreams now suffering from. Now it's not going to be a 5/5, which might be a little too good, but at a 4/5, this card might stick for multiple turns a lot more. And I definitely think, given that Brynjolf is the namesake of one of the Heroes of Skyrim pre-constructed decks, they were probably disappointed that this card was not really played anywhere, even in decks that use agility that I guess a lot of us probably thought Brynjolf would find a home in, such as Pilfer Monk. It seems to line up perfectly with the effect. I've seen Pilfer Monk decks without even using Brynjolf, which is pretty surprising, definitely not where they wanted the Brynjolf to be. So out of 4 or 5, I could definitely see including it in a lot more of those decks. I don't think it buffs them too much, the decks I mean, but Brynjolf itself does seem like much more of a powerful card. Definitely not something I feel bad about playing into a blue deck with Lightning Bolts anymore, and definitely not something I could see immediately dying every time one of my opponent's cards attacked it. So I'm excited about Brynjolf for sure. Cliffside Lookout, another one that just didn't see any play. Unlike Brynjolf, the effect is a bit less powerful. The dragon decks that I've seen so far don't really care too much about like a beefy 3-drop. They aren't super aggressive. Maybe a more mid-rangey dragon monk deck could make use of Cliffside Lookout now. 2/5 is definitely a good stat line for a 3-drop, given if the effect is good enough. Dark Guardian is a 3-drop, 2/5 with guard, of course, which saves the card. But if you can set up a situation where you can buff the Cliffside Lookout reliably, starting at a 2/5 does make a hell of a difference compared to starting as a 2/4. Now, Young Dragonborn is a weird one. This card has definitely always been pretty bad. Shockingly bad, as a matter of fact. And I say shockingly bad because its effect is actually pretty interesting. And it always sort of weirded me out that it was on such a low-cost body. It was so unlikely to ever really get the effect off. And it seemed sort of like just a really, really weak card in general, given that it was given such an effect that you'd think they would try to make it a bit more playable. And I guess they've done that with the 3/3 boost. That said, it's still such an unreliable card with such a weird gimmicky effect that I don't think it sees any slots in a constructed deck that's trying to be optimal and win a lot of games. But at the very least, Young Dragonborn is now a card that I feel slightly less bad about picking in Arena. So that's it for the card changes, and if we scroll up to the top again, you can see that there are some bug fixes as well as the card changes, such as Shadowmere's Last Gasp fixed. Mage's Trick can now successfully be used on yourself to break your own rune. Now that's something that I'm pretty happy about because I did try that, sort of an experimental for science type of deal in a tournament match where I was already losing the game to a pretty much irreparable position, and I decided to try to Mage's Trick myself when I was at 26 to draw another card. It didn't work and I promptly conceded, but it's good to know that that is now something that you can do. And there are a couple other bug fixes that you may or may not have known about that you can see here. Again, you can click the link in the description to read this whole article as well at your leisure, and some general bug fixes, but the card changes are definitely the meat of this announcement. And of course, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Let me know if you think these were too harsh on some of the nerfs, if you're excited to play some of the newly buffed cards, and what decks you think are going to be the major players of the post-card change meta moving forward. Feel free to leave a like if you've enjoyed the video and the analysis as well, and as always, consider subscribing to the channel for more Legends content every single day, from videos like this to gameplay videos and other strategy content. Check out my stream in the description, and I'll see you guys next time.